In today's video, we are going to go through the events of 2021's horror thriller Son. Spoilers ahead, you have been warned. Make sure to give this video a thumbs up, comment on what your favorite part was, and subscribe to our channel for more. At the beginning of the movie, a pregnant woman is seen in a diner. The waitress gives her a hot cup of coffee when we see the woman is not wearing any shoes and her feet are muddy. She seems distressed. Two men enter the diner and sit in the booth right behind her. Seeing them, the woman gets alerted and runs out to her car. She drives away, frequently checking if they are chasing her. Her water breaks while she is driving. She gives birth to a little boy while yelling that she doesn't want him. It is 8 years later. Laura and her 8-year-old son David live together happily. She works in a kindergarten as a teacher while going to college to study psychology. David is in middle school. One night, Laura puts David to bed and goes to her room to study. Sometime later, she hears someone walking outside. Assuming it is David coming to sleep in her room, she dismisses it at first. Then she goes to check on him and sees several people standing around his bed. She tries to go in, but someone locks the door from inside. Laura freaks out and runs outside to call someone for help. She bangs on her neighbor Susan's door and asks her to call the police. When she runs back to the house, the doors have opened. She goes in and sees a naked David fast asleep on his bed. Laura hugs her son and cries. The next morning, Detective Paul comes to investigate the case, but there is no sign of home invasion. The other police officer thinks that Laura had a lucid dream, but Paul tells her that he believes her. Laura asks David if he had opened his clothes at night by himself. David is not sure, but says that it is possible because he frequently gets hot at night. The next day at work, Detective Paul visits Laura to tell her that they did not find any new fingerprints in David's room. Laura still insists that what she saw was real. That night, Laura hears a noise and comes downstairs. There, she sees a shadow walking past the door and quickly calls Paul. He comes over to check, but finds nothing. He and Laura are in the kitchen talking about the case when David comes downstairs with his hands on his stomach. He says that it hurts a lot and proceeds to vomit blood. They rush the kid to the hospital. As the doctors open his clothes to check him, they see various marks on his body. He tries to restrict them from touching them and loses his control. Later, the doctor tells Laura that every test result they had run on David came negative. They do not know what is wrong with him. David's conditioning is worsening by the second, and the doctor assumes that at this rate, he won't be alive tomorrow. Laura is in shock. She cries as she sees David in that condition. She falls asleep beside his bed. Later at night, David vomits blood again. Laura calls the doctors. They see that David is gaining his consciousness back. It is now the next morning, and David is as good as ever. It is as if he was never sick. The doctors claim that it is a miracle. Laura, David, and Paul go to a diner, but David refuses to eat anything. Laura wants to sell the house they live in and start fresh, but Paul advises her to take it slow. They are back home, and Laura puts David to sleep. Downstairs, she asks Paul to stay for the night. They start to make out when David yells, calling for Laura. They rush up to see him having a seizure. He is rushed back to the hospital. The doctors still can't figure out his illness. Later, Laura reveals to Paul that she was raised in a cult and escaped 8 years ago. She predicts that the people in David's room were members of the cult, giving this sickness to David. Paul is in disbelief. Laura falls asleep beside David's hospital bed that night too. When she wakes up, she hears the doctors talking to each other, saying that the boy is their priority. They also talk about someone arriving. Laura goes to check from the window and sees two men running towards the hospital. Laura senses something wrong, so she picks David up and rushes to another room. The doctors come after but do not see them. She rushes him to their neighbor Susan's house. While Laura is out fetching clothes and money from her house, David wakes up and asks Susan to come closer. Laura calls Paul and tells him to meet her outside David's school in an hour. When she goes back to Susan's, nobody opens the door. Laura enters through the back door cautiously and is shocked to see David feeding on dead Susan. He says that he feels so much better now. Laura takes David to the shower and washes the blood off him. She puts him to bed and goes back to clean up Susan's body. Laura then writes, "He is coming," and draws a symbol on the wall with Susan's blood. She takes David and drives off. On her way, Paul calls her, but she throws her phone out of the window. They stay at a motel for the night. The news of them being missing is on the TV. They then drive off to see one of Laura's old friends in a different car. Meanwhile, the police find Susan's dead body. Paul and his partner Steve find out that Laura's real name is Anna, and she was abused and held captive for 13 years by her pedophile father. Laura stops at a woman named Mrs. Nagel. The woman refers to her as Anna and asks if David is her father. Laura asks her about someone named Jimmy and finds that he is in a place called Kalachmont Square in Mississippi. On the other hand, Paul finds out that Laura used to be in a mental asylum and goes to see her doctor. The doctor tells him that she was highly delusional. When asked about the cult she had mentioned, he tells Paul that it is all part of a delusion. She and Jimmy Nagel were sold to other men by Laura's father for money. Paul then sets off to look for Nagel as well. Laura finally meets Jimmy. She tells him that she doesn't remember anything about the cult since she was given a lot of medicine in the asylum, but Jimmy remembers he was also a victim of the cult, so she asks him for information. Jimmy tells her that David is the child of the devil. Only Laura had the power to call him to the earth, and so they made Laura have sex with the devil to create this child. Laura remembers being on a bed in front of the cult and meeting the devil. David starts to get sick again. He tells Laura that everything in his body hurts. She takes him to a nearby motel, but David gets sicker and sicker. Laura knows that the only way to help him is to feed him a human. She rushes back to her car to calm herself down when she sees a man beating a girl for money. She goes back to David, who begs her to bring her food. Laura then goes out again and seduces the man from earlier to come to her room. David hides under the bed as Laura brings the man to the bathroom. Both of them start to undress. Just then, David attacks the man and eats his flesh. Laura cannot watch it anymore, so she comes out of the room to calm herself. When she goes back in, the man's body is in pieces. David has eaten most of him. He watches cartoons on the TV as Laura cleans up the mess and collects the body parts in a garbage bag. They leave the motel at night and drive off to an abandoned church. Laura gets rid of the body there and writes, "He is coming," with the same symbol on a nearby wall. They then flee to another motel nearby. Meanwhile, Paul and Steve reach Jimmy's only to find him dead. He has the same words written on his chest. Steve is sure now that Laura is behind all the murders. Paula seems to think the same. At the new motel, David tells Laura about a dream where he could fly. They chat for a while, after which Laura says that she won't be able to help him the next time he gets hungry. David tells her that if she doesn't help him, he will die. Laura starts to cry. David wants to go out somewhere to have fun. Laura decides to take him to the carnival at night. Later, they go to the carnival and have a lot of fun, but David starts to get sick again. This time his stomach starts to bleed. He is in a lot of pain, so Laura takes him back to the motel. Laura tries to calm him down, but the pain is too much for David to handle. It is dark in the room when 3 police officers arrive. Laura had taken the man's gun from the previous motel. Scared, she fires at the policeman. When she turns the lights on, she sees all 3 of the police officers lying on the ground. She has shot them. One of them is Steve. She apologizes to him and tries to help him, but to no avail. The policemen are dead. Scared, she picks up David again and rushes out. Other people from the motel notice them running away, but do not do anything. Laura has enough of this, so she decides to drive back to the place it all started. It is the place she dreams about every night. In the dream, she is in her room on the bed surrounded by members of the cult. Her father tells her to chant the verses. As she does that, an entity appears in the room. He is the devil and the birth father of David. On her way there, she calls Paul and apologizes to him for killing his friend. She also tells him that she is going to the place this all started. He tries to calm her, but Laura cuts the phone. Laura finally reaches the place and goes to her old room. She sits on the floor with David and chants the verses, but no one arrives. She threatens him that she will kill David if he doesn't come out. She wants the entity to cure David. She repeatedly chants the verses when suddenly we see someone standing behind her. As she is about to turn around, Paul and other police officers enter the room. The entity from behind her disappears. She blames Paul for making him go. According to Laura, those people who came to her home that night fed David human flesh. This triggered the evil in David that was handed to him by his birth father. Now, Laura has no other way but to kill David. She doesn't want him to live like this. As she is about to stab him, the officers shoot her dead and save David. David and Paul are at the hospital. David is still very ill when suddenly Paul cuts some flesh out of his arm and feeds him. He has been one of the members of the cult the whole time. He then introduces David to his father. The movie ends as we see David hug the entity and call him Daddy. Thanks for watching. Make sure to like and comment on the video if you enjoyed it, and subscribe to the channel to see more of these movie summaries.